of us have, on occasion, met religious people who think that piety is enough. Justification by faith alone, if you wish. Mercifully, Arthur is not one of those. He is someone who believes, like Coleridge in The Ancient Mariner, that he prayeth best who loveth best all things both great and small. And if you respect God's creation, the very least you can do is to try and save it for the future. Arthur has a very distinguished history and a distinguished future as an ecologist. Despite his youthful good looks, he spent 5 years at the Smithsonian, 11 years in the South Pacific, 3 years in Africa, and 30 years in Europe, working mostly for the UNEP, but also United Nations Environment Programme, but also for a lot of other environmental good causes. He is a visiting professor at Brighton and at the European Centre for Peace and Development in Belgrade. He is also the founder and director of the International Environment Forum, which is a wonderful institution which links together people who have an interest in the environment and environmentalism and ecology. And since at present the subscription is nothing, I can't see any reason why anyone would not be a member of it. It's a wonderful institution, and I'm sure that if you send Arthur an email, he will tell you how to join. But today, Arthur is not talking primarily about ecology. He's talking about the new statement of the Bahá'í International Community to the United Nations. Just over 75 years ago, the Central Hall, Westminster, was host to a remarkable meeting, the first ever meeting of the General Assembly of the United Nations. And more than ever, we see now with coronavirus, we need the UN. And yet, more than ever, we are beset by a style of leadership in many, many countries, which you could call the big man style. So the humanities beginning to feel, as Tom Lehrer put it, a bit like a Christian Scientist with appendicitis. We all know the remedy is to turn to the UN, to turn to unity, and yet many of our governments are not that keen at so doing. And this message is timely and relevant. Arthur.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I appreciate your quoting Coleridge. It's nice to bring the arts into these subjects whenever possible. It's clear anybody who follows the news today, and it's very hard not to follow the news today, can be very depressed by what they read, whether it be the pandemic, the climate crisis, biodiversity hecatomb, the arms race, failed governance. We seem to be heading for catastrophe in many ways. The United Nations, which you said just celebrated its 70th anniversary, seems less and less able to deal with these complex issues and challenges. How can we put the world on the path towards a just global order? Can the institution and the responsibilities that we accept as natural and normal at the national level in a national government also be extended to our global planetary system in a world that is now physically integrated as never before, even if it is increasingly fragmented? As mentioned, the Bahá'í International Community, which is the structure that represents the Bahá'í faith at the United Nations, prepared a statement for the 70th anniversary with some of its ideas for how to address these problems going forward. So perhaps we could first share a very short video clip, just a minute and a half, that they prepared with some of the key themes of this statement. video of that launch is available on the Baha'i community website. There's another, we'll share a link later. They provided another hour-long discussion of the statement for the Geneva Peace Week last week that's also available on the web. So if you want to go further, there are other resources available. So I'll share my screen now because most of the texts that I'll be sharing with you are in fact official texts from the Baha'i community and the Baha'i governing bodies. So the international governing body of the Baha'i faith, which is the Universal House of Justice, has already addressed challenges of achieving world peace in several statements, most recently in January of last year. And it noted after the First World War and the Paris Peace Conference, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, who was the leader of the Baha'i faith at that time, this is in the 1920s, said Shoghi could discern the progress, however fitful, of the forces working in harmony with the spirit of the age. These forces, the House continues, have continued to move humanity towards an age of peace, not merely a peace which rules out armed conflict, but a collective state of well-being, manifesting unity. I think it's a beautiful definition of what peace should be, a collective state of well-being, manifesting unity. Notwithstanding, it remains a long journey, and it proceeds in fits and starts. They continue, there have been at least 3 historical moments in the last 100 years when it seems as if the human race was reaching for real, lasting peace, albeit always falling short because of the weaknesses it could not overcome. The first moment, as a result of the Paris Conference, was the establishment of the League of Nations, an organization intended by its founders to secure peace at the international level. And we still have the Palais des Nations in Geneva as a remainder of that organization from before World War II. And this was the council chamber in which they hoped to achieve peace but failed to do so. The second historical moment, when not only was the United Nations organization formed from the ashes of the League, but a system of international economic institutions, that is, the IMF and the World Bank, came into being. And historic advances were made related to human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights, and international law. So we have then United Nations, which we then now just celebrating 75th anniversary. At the end of the Cold War, towards the end of the 20th century, was an occasion for relief, giving rise to explicit calls for the establishment of a new global order. This was the third moment when universal peace seemed to be within grasp. And there was in the year 2000, large meetings in New York with 1,400 NGOs and so on, hoping to move forward the agenda towards peace. But these various advances, despite their many limitations and imperfections and the horrifying conflicts that continued to unfold during this time, nonetheless stand as signs of a widespread, gradual, but inexorable rise in global consciousness on the part of the Earth's peoples and their attraction to universal justice, to solidarity, to collaboration, to compassion, and to equality, all values that we really need to be pushing forward today as much as we can. Unfortunately, as the present century opened, new challenges began to loom. With time, these intensified, leading to a retreat from the promising steps forward with which the previous century had closed. Today, many of the dominant currents in societies everywhere are pushing people apart, not drawing together, and we've seen more examples recently. And the House mentions these currents including exorbitant wealth, intransigence in thinking, as we've seen, for instance, in America, religious fundamentalism, a decline in public trust, vested interests seeking to undermine the credibility of all sources of knowledge, including science and, as we've seen with climate change, and the resurgent forces of racism, nationalism, and factionalism. So we are warned, thus, to the forces of disintegration, regroup, and gain ground. So be it, says the House of Justice. The unification of humanity is unstoppable by any human force, because this is really a divine promise that we will achieve this unification. The tumult raised by the contending peoples of the earth threatens to drown out the voices of these noble-minded souls in every society who call for an end to conflict and struggle. As long as that call goes unheeded, as it has so far, there is no reason to doubt that the world's current state of disorder and confusion will worsen, possibly with catastrophic consequences, until a chastened humanity sees fit to take another significant step, perhaps this time decisive, towards enduring peace. And that's really the challenge we're facing now. Can we avoid catastrophe? What will it take? It took World War I for the first step, World War II for the second step. What will it take to finally achieve this peace that we so need and has been promised to us? So here we are celebrating the 70th anniversary of the United Nations, and the whole process has been started in the UN Secretary General to consider where the UN should be 25 years from now, at its 100th anniversary, rethinking the structures and all the rest. So there's a whole process of exploring deeply where we need to go from here. And this is why it's appropriate that the Baha'i community should release a statement for this anniversary, a governance befitting humanity and the path towards a just global order. And they organized public launching, as I mentioned, 22nd of October, where you can see the video, an hour and 20 minutes. Available link, you can see that afterwards. And therefore, they produced this beautiful statement, which I will spend most of this fireside exploring, largely with the text available to it, because it really helps us to understand where we are and what we can do ourselves to take this process forward. There are many things that we can do already in our local communities. We don't have to wait for the global system to be changed internationally for us to address these problems. So the statement begins. 70th anniversary of the United Nations arrives as rapidly shifting global realities prompt a deeper appreciation of humanity's interconnection and interdependence. Amidst the disruption created and accelerated by a world-engulfing pandemic, numerous possibilities are opening for marked social change that can bring stability to the world and enrich the lives of its inhabitants. Throughout history, periods of turbulence, such as we're experiencing today, have presented opportunities to redefine collective values and the assumptions that underlie them. So too does the present moment, and the statement tries to challenge some of those assumptions and redefine them. The range of areas in which established systems and approaches are in need of radical transformation suggest how critical the coming quarter century, stretching from the 70th anniversary to its centenary, will be in determining the fortunes of humanity. A growing chorus of voices is calling for decisive steps forward in our collective trajectory towards enduring universal peace. It is a call that must be answered. And here I think we all need to be saying, what can we do to help to answer that call and bring others to do the same thing? They continue with a fundamental theme of the Baha'i faith for the last 170 years. Oneness. The human family is one. This is a truth that has been embraced by multitudes around the world. Its profound implications for collective behavior must now give rise to a coordinated movement toward higher levels of social and political unity. As Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, declared over a century ago, true peace and tranquility would only be realized when every soul will have become the well-wisher of all mankind. That's a great challenge and one we can be working on. The perils of a global community divided against itself are too great to countenance, and we see warnings of that every day around us. And they then summarize, the past century saw many steps, imperfect yet significant, in laying the groundwork for a world order that would secure international peace and the prosperity of all. There was the League of Nations, which lasted 25 years. The United Nations has tripled that, so already 75 years. Indeed, it is without parallel as a structure to engage all the world's nations and a forum to express humanity's common will. Yet, recent events demonstrate that current arrangements are no longer sufficient in the face of cascading and increasingly interconnected threats. I think, my work is in system science. You see more and more how we cannot look at peace separate from health, separate from the environment. Everything is connected to everything else today. Integration and coordination must therefore be extended further. The only viable way forward lies in a system of deepening global cooperation. The present anniversary provides an opportune moment to begin building consensus about how the international community can better organize itself and to consider what will be the standards by which to measure progress. This, of course, means more complex levels of integration. In recent years, reasoned critique of multilateral arrangements has, at times, been eclipsed by rejection of the very idea of a rules-based international order. And we've seen various regimes around the world fighting back against any kind of international organization to defend their national interests. Yet, this period of pushback is embedded in a broader historical process carrying the global community toward stronger unity. In a sense, the planet is telling us today we need stronger unity. At each stage in human history, more complex levels of integration become not only possible, but necessary. New and more pressing challenges emerge, and the body politic is compelled to devise new arrangements that address the needs of the time through greater inclusivity, coherence, and collaboration. I think three beautiful words that we should consider in everything we do: being more inclusive, more coherent, and collaborating with everybody that we can. The demands of the present moment are pushing existing structures for facilitating deliberations among nations, as well as a system of conflict resolution beyond their capacity for effectiveness. We therefore find ourselves at the threshold of a defining task, purposefully organizing our affairs in full consciousness of ourselves as one people in one shared homeland, which is so obvious scientifically and is still far from accepted politically. And one of the first steps was this United Nations conference in 1972, where creating the Human Environment Program, where the slogan was "Only One Earth." I took this picture there. I was representing the Baha'i community at that conference in 1972 in Stockholm. To acknowledge the oneness of the human family is not to call for uniformity or to relinquish the wide range of established systems of governance. We need to reassure governments we're not taking everything away from them. A true appreciation for the oneness of humanity contains within it the essential concept of diversity. What is needed today is a settled consensus that, while preserving the various systems and cultures around the world, embodies a set of common values and principles that can attract the support of every nation. A measure of agreement around these shared principles and norms can already be discerned in the ideals that inform global agendas, such as the universality of human rights, and all is said about human rights today around the world, the imperative to eradicate poverty, the goal of the UN at a very fundamental level, and sustainability as well, or the need to live within environmentally sustainable limits. But there is further to go, and the challenges, telling implications of such ideals must be reckoned with. We pay lip service to these things. Often we fall short in actually following through with them. So a framework that accommodates a diversity of approaches, built on a commitment to unity and a shared ethic of justice, would allow common principles to put into practice in countless arrangements and formulations. There's not one way of doing things. We need to explore many things. So within such a framework, differences in political structure, legal systems, and social organization would stand not as points of friction, but as sources of potential insight to new solutions and approaches. We should be experimenting all around the world. To the extent that nations commit to learn from one another, ingrained habits of contest and blame can be replaced by a culture of cooperation and exploration, and a willing acceptance of setbacks and missteps as inevitable aspects of the learning process. I think something in the United Nations, we need to learn to go beyond the positioning of each country against others to say, let's learn together while we cooperate and explore. So the true acknowledgement of our global interdependence requires a genuine concern for all, without distinction. Deceptively simple, this principle, which the UN has talked about leaving no one behind, implies a profound reordering of priorities. Too often, advancement of the common good is approached as a secondary objective, commendable, but to be pursued only after other narrower national interests have been secured. This must change, for the welfare of any segment of humanity is inextricably bound up with the welfare of the whole, as the pandemic is teaching us today. There's no way anybody can escape from this around the world. So the starting point for consultation on any program or policy must be a consideration of the impact it will have on all segments of society. Leaders and policymakers are thus confronted with a critical question in considering the merits of any proposed action, be it local, national, or international. Will a decision advance the good of humankind in its entirety? How often in a local community, in a mayor or in the country, do you say, what is going to be the impact on the whole planet of what we're doing here? That's a whole new framework in which we should be considering every decision that we are taking. And whatever benefits have accrued from past concessions of state sovereignty, which is, of course, at the core of the present United Nations, present conditions demand a far more holistic and coherent approach to analysis and decision-making. So what will be the global implications of domestic policies? What choices contribute to shared prosperity and sustainable peace? What steps foster nobility and preserve human dignity? This should be on the agenda of everything at the United Nations and in every government. As awareness of the oneness of humanity is increasingly woven into processes of decision-making, nations will find it easier to see each other as genuine partners in the stewardship of the planet and securing the prosperity of its peoples. So when leaders consider the impact of policies before them, they will need to give thought to what so many might term the human spirit, that essential quality which seeks meaning and aspires to transcendence. These less tangible dimensions of human existence have typically been viewed as confined to the realm of personal belief and lying outside the concern of policymakers and administrators. But experience has shown that progress for all is not attainable if material advancement is divorced from spiritual and ethical advancement. And we can see in many countries today, materially we're very advanced, but ethically and spiritually we seem to be very primitive and far behind. For example, economic growth over recent decades has indisputably brought about prosperity for many. But with that growth unmoored from justice and equity, a few have disproportionately benefited from its fruits, and many are in precarious conditions. Those living in poverty are at the greatest risk from any contraction of the world economy, which exacerbates existing inequalities and intensifies suffering. When we look at the poor parts of the world, we might say, how is it possible, with so much wealth on this planet, and so much more created but still half the world population struggles to live properly each day? This is ethically unacceptable, and yet this is the reality of many parts of the world. We have to look then for our moral assumptions. Every effort to advance society, even if concerned with material conditions alone, rests on underlying moral assumptions. Whether it be profit is only in accounts, or whether it be we really need to look at the needs of all humanity. Every policy reflects convictions about human nature and the values that further various social ends and the way that given rights and responsibilities inform one another. These assumptions determine the degree to which any decision will yield universal benefit. They must therefore be the object of careful and honest examination. Only by ensuring that material progress is consciously connected to spiritual and social progress can the promise of a better world be fulfilled. And that's really where we need to be building this balance in the world with our efforts on the spiritual and social side. We have the example already from the Baha'i World Center of an attempt to achieve both material beauty and spiritual beauty, trying to strike that balance. So the movement towards more coordinated and genuinely cooperative international relations will eventually require a process in which world leaders come together to recast and reconstitute the global order. So we need another conference like the one that created the United Nations or the one that created the League of Nations, where finally leaders say we need to rebuild something better than what we have now. For what once was viewed as an idealistic vision of international cooperation has, in the light of obvious and serious challenges facing humanity, become a pragmatic necessity. So the efficacy of steps in this direction will hinge on well-worn patterns of stalemate and impasse being relinquished in favor of a global civic ethic. Deliberative processes will need to be more magnanimous, reasoned, and cordial, motivated not by attachment to entrenched positions and narrow interests, as we see most of the time in the UN today, but by a collective search for deeper understanding of complex issues. Objectives incompatible with the pursuit of the common good will need to be set aside. Until this is the dominant ethic, lasting progress will prove elusive, as it has been for the last 75 years. Such a posture reinforces a process-oriented approach to progress, building gradually on strengths and responding to evolving realities, and as collective capacity for reasoned and dispassionate inquiry into the merits of any given proposal grows, a range of reforms are worthy of further deliberation, and they make some suggestions. For example, establishing a second chamber of the General Assembly of the United Nations, where representatives are directly elected, a so-called World Parliamentary Assembly, could do much to strengthen the legitimacy and connection people have to that global body. A World Council on Future Affairs, which doesn't exist now, could institutionalize consideration of how policies might impact generations to come and give attention to a range of issues, such as preparedness for global crises, as we've seen with our failure now with the pandemic, or the use of emerging technologies. We talk about artificial intelligence taking over the world, or the future of education or employment, where many people are losing their jobs today. So strengthening the legal framework relating to the natural world would lend coherence and vigor to biodiversity, climate, and environmental regimes, and provide a robust foundation for a system of common stewardship of the planet's resources. You can see that we live in a single environment today, that frontiers mean nothing in terms of climate change and biodiversity, and therefore we need to be able to make laws internationally for greenhouse gas emissions, protecting species, and so on, which no one country can anymore do by themselves. Reforming the overall structure for promoting and sustaining peace, including reform of the Security Council itself, would enable familiar patterns of paralysis and deadlock, only too familiar in the present Security Council, to give way to more decisive response to the threat of conflict. And that would help us really take an enormous step towards peace. Such initiatives, or comparable innovations, and there are many others, would require much focused deliberation, and there would need to be a general consensus in favor of each for it to win acceptance and legitimacy. Of course, they would not in themselves be sufficient to meet the needs of humanity. Nevertheless, to the degree that they would be improvements what exists today, each could contribute its share to a process of growth and development that is truly transformative. And these are step-by-step ways that we could achieve the ideal that we need to get to. The world the international community has committed to build itself to build, in which violence and corruption have given way to peace and good governance, for example, and where the equality of women and men has been infused into every facet of social life, has never yet existed. Progress towards the goals enshrined in global agendas, therefore, calls for a conscious orientation towards experimentation, search, innovation, and creativity, So really we're opening the door to say, let's explore all the possibilities going forward. As these processes unfold, the moral framework already defined by the nation's charter must be applied with increasing fidelity. Respect for international law. At the present time, of course, you have an International Court of Justice, but it's only voluntary. Upholding fundamental human rights, which often are still infringed today. Adherence to treaties and agreements. We see how easily one country can withdraw from the Paris Agreement on climate change and other treaties and agreements. Only to the extent such commitments are honored in practice, the United Nations and its member states demonstrate a standard of integrity and trustworthiness before the people of the world. And clearly we cannot say that many governments show integrity and trustworthiness in the world of today. Barring this, no amount of administrative or organization will resolve the host of long-standing challenges before us. So we can't just tinker with the machinery. We must get down to the moral values, the ethical foundations. As Baha'u'llah declared, words must be supported by deeds, for deeds are the true test of words. And this is Baha'u'llah's shrine in the Holy Land, which is a very important place for the Baha'is. So the years concluding the United Nations first century represent a period of immense opportunity. Collaboration is possible on scales undreamed of in the past ages, opening unparalleled prospects for progress. And we can see the fact that people around the world are following this fireside this evening, and we can send email and so on and so forth. We've got no ways of cooperation that didn't exist before. Yet failure to reach an arrangement supporting effective global coordination risks consequences far more severe, potentially catastrophic, than those arising from recent disruption. So we really have the warning here, if we don't change, things could get much worse. The task before the community of nations, then, is to ensure that the machinery of international politics and power is increasingly directed towards cooperation and unity. At the centenary United Nations, might it not be possible for all the inhabitants of our common homeland to be confident that we have set in motion realistic process for building the global order needed to sustain progress in the coming centuries? This is the hope of the Baha'i International Community and the goal towards which it labors. And this statement is one effort to push that process forward. We echo the poignant appeal long ago voiced by Baha'u'llah about the leaders and arbiters of human affairs. Let them take counsel together and, through anxious and full of deliberation, administer to a diseased and sorely afflicted world the remedy it requireth. So, what can we do about all of this? This year, the Universal House of Justice, as I mentioned before, is the governing body of the Baha'i faith, has helped us to see what we can do to contribute to a path to a just global order. So I have just a few short quotations in closing from some of their recent guidance to us that I think will help us all to see ways forward. This is the seat of the Universal House of Justice on Mount Carmel in Haifa, Israel. And they wrote in March 2020, so very recently, seldom has it been more evident that society's collective strength is dependent on the unity it can manifest in action, from the international stage to the grassroots. And the grassroots is where we could already start to work. The world stands more and more in need of the hope and strength of spirit that faith imparts. Hope has been a rare commodity, I think, for many people today. And so we need to focus more on that. I just recently published a book, In Pursuit of Hope. For those who want to go further, how can we find hope in spite of all the problems we're facing in the world today? And the House continues, however difficult matters are at present, and however close the limits of their endurance some sections of societies are brought, and we can see we're getting close to those limits in many places today. Humanity will ultimately pass through this ordeal, and it will emerge on the other side with greater insight and a deeper appreciation of its inherent oneness and interdependence. So we're assured, we're promised that we may go through great difficulties, but we can see a much better view of the lessons we've learned on the other side. Leaders, prominent thinkers, and commentators have begun to explore fundamental concepts and bold aspirations that, in recent times, have been largely absent from public discourse. We've not talked much about UN reform recently. At present, these are but early glimmerings, yet they hold out the possibility that a moment of collective consciousness may be in view. At a time when the urgency of attaining higher levels of unity, founded on the incontestable truth of humanity's oneness, is becoming apparent to larger and larger numbers, society stands in need of clear voices that can articulate the spiritual principles that underlie such aspirations. And each of us at our own level can try to be one of those clear voices about those principles. World unity is finally possible. A global order that unifies the nations with the asset of humanity is the only adequate answer to the destabilizing forces that threaten the world. However, though world unity is possible, nay, inevitable, it ultimately cannot be achieved without unreserved acceptance of the oneness of humankind, which has been the key theme of this statement. Fostering unity by harmonizing disparate elements and nurturing in every heart a selfless love for humankind is the task of religion, and therefore the Baha'i faith is one of those to be working to achieve this selfless love and this harmonization, this unity in the world. No matter how bleak conditions may appear at any given time, no matter how dismal the immediate prospects for bringing about unity, there is no cause for despair. The distressing state of the world can only spur us to redouble our commitment to constructive action. Why waste your time battling, the old things? Let's build the new. These are not days of prosperity and triumph, cautions Baha'u'llah himself. The whole of mankind is in the grip of manifold ills. Strive, therefore, to save its life through the wholesome medicine which the almighty hand of the unerring physician hath prepared. Consider Baha'u'llah's words. Address yourselves to the promotion of the well-being and tranquility of the children of men. Bend your minds and wills to the education of the peoples and kindreds of the earth, that haply the dissensions that divide it may, through the power of the most great name, be blotted out from its face, and all mankind become the upholders of one order and the inhabitants of one city. So, sensitized as they are to the importance of harmony and the fruitlessness of conflict, the followers of Baha'u'llah seek to cultivate those conditions that are most conducive to the emergence of unity in any setting. We are heartened to see the believers expanding their efforts to participate in the discourses of society, especially those friends who, in their professional capacity, are able to contribute to discourses directly related to peace. And since I've worked in this area with two Baha'i colleagues, we published at the beginning of this year, Cambridge University Press, a whole book on global governance and the emergence of global institutions in the 21st century that goes much further in proposals than we have seen in the statement you hear this evening. So the devoted efforts that we our like-minded collaborators are making to build communities founded on spiritual principles, to apply those principles for the betterment of our societies, and to offer the insights arising, these are the surest ways that we can all hasten the fulfillment of the promise of world peace. So I want to thank you so much for listening to this. I hope it's not been too boring, because I've tried to stick to the text so beautifully written that it's hard to get away from them. I've included in this summary and available the written text available that the organizers can share afterwards if you want, all of the text that I've shared with you this evening, and the links to all of the original sources if you want to go further with any of this. So thank you very much for your patience in listening to me.
Thank you ever so much, Arthur. That's a fantastic tour de force. Basically, the world needs unity, the world will have unity, and the world needs to move together morally and spiritually as well as materially, and needs to become more generous in sharing information and ideals in moving in that direction.